in economic policy making over the last few decades. This was at a time when there was basically only one goal. It was growth. There were other sub-goals, but it was mainly only growth. Now that China is widening its set of policy objectives, it seems harder for the same apparatus and processes to actually deliver on that. And so there seems to be something of an institutional and political economy nature that makes it hard to make those changes. And can the institutional hindrances in China be overcome? I would think so, but it does require strong leadership at the very top, at the very top level. And it remains to be seen how China will be able to meet those challenges of ensuring a clearer delineation between the state and the market. I think in India, as we all know, the policy formulation involves many more stakeholders and it's more complicated, and especially the emergence of new political parties, especially at the state level, has further complicated things in this area. And certain things that in China we take for granted, just in India seem so much harder to pull off, not because of a lack of technical capacity or intellectual understanding, but the political economy of something as simple as raising electricity tariffs to cost recovery levels. The political economy seems so complicated that is to the extent that it hinders infrastructure development. Same thing on land acquisition. These are not technological or technical issues. These are political economy issues. So the governance issues that affect public services and infrastructure are, as Edwin rightly focused on, I think are absolutely key in India. If you want to look for a silver lining, you may see it in India in several states where, despite this tremendously complicated political economy landscape, it seems that in some states with voters becoming more aware and more mature, perhaps, that voters are starting to vote back in power chief ministers that have delivered with good economic policies and have delivered on public services and have delivered on things like female literacy. If you want to look for a silver lining, maybe you can find it at the state level in India. The question is whether this can be repeated more nationally. I just want to end with a few remarks on the outlook and more what are the key concerns, key risks. I think, as many of the previous people already said, in China we don't really doubt very much that China can achieve its growth. Usually the concern is, will growth be too strong rather than will it be high enough? I think China's is already making a lot of progress with the one key objective of the 12th Five-Year Plan that not many people talk about. We all know that rebalancing is a key objective of the 12th Five-Year Plan. China actually has a second key objective. It is moving up the value chain, improving the industrial structure. There's already a lot of progress being made on this, so I don't worry too much about it. In fact, I'm worried that too much progress with that moving up the value chain and too much progress in terms of how local governments try to do about this may actually hinder the rebalancing, because there is some tension between these two. So my key concern on China would be, my key risk would be, will there be enough progress with rebalancing because of these political economy issues? In India, I think the challenge is a little bit the other way around. India, in my view, will continue to grow at decent rates, but will continue to have these issues for quite a while. Governance hindering infrastructure and public services to such an extent that the supply side of the economy will struggle to keep pace with the aspirations and demands for growth that there are among policymakers and the public, and that this will continue to make India's macro picture more challenging than in China, because we always have in China, in India, we always have the issue of high aspirations, high demand growth, but the supply side struggling, and many of the macro issues that we see at the moment, with respect to the currency, with respect to inflation, with respect to the increasing current account deficit, are a follow-up on this, are a consequence. So I want to end over for now.
Very interesting. Mr. Gupta, what are your thoughts?
I guess the first thing I'd say as a good portfolio manager is a disclaimer that I'm neither an academic or an economist. So my comments are more shorter term and perhaps biased towards capitalism. I guess the first thing I'd say is it's probably a little bit unfair to compare India and China with the same yardstick. There are two very big differences in the countries. The first is that if you look at any country in Southeast Asia, whether it's Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, China, they have transitioned to a higher growth plane with a political structure which was either from an autocrat or a single party, where decision making is very simple. India is really the first time that this transition is happening under democracy, which requires a different time frame and a different expectation, I guess. The second big difference is that from an administration perspective, India inherited institutions of governance, of examining policy, of planning, which has a lot of credibility, that whenever any of these institutions say something, people believe it. Today they are becoming a little bit of a burden in terms of decision making, but there is credibility in what they're saying. China, on the other hand, has a very opposite structure. It is a very streamlined administration which allowed policies to be put in place and decisions to be taken very fast. But from a market participant perspective, everyone questions to a certain extent the numbers that come out of China, whether they have credibility and whether they're believable or not, whether it's from the banking system or from the economics perspective. But they're very different situations. And I think despite the fact that both of the countries started off as very similar economies with very large populations, with an agricultural-based economy, with an intention of growth and inclusion, today they find themselves at diametrically opposite points in terms of their problems. China has a demand problem, an ample supply, and India has a supply problem, and ample demand. So there's something probably to be learned by both countries. My second comment more relates to I guess, what is on the anvil both for India and China over the short and medium term. I think India has basically three problems. One is that the investment cycle has stopped. Cross-fixed capital formation has stopped, and they need to find a way to start that again. The second is that they need to find a way to manage their twin deficits. And the third is that they need to reinstitute confidence from the domestic industry and from foreign investors in the policy making of the country over a medium time frame. And to a certain extent, I don't think there is too much debate about what they need to do. There is relative consensus, at least from people outside, of what are the reforms that are required. And it's a little bit disappointing that the things have not been done for some good reasons. Whichever order you put them in, there has to be a land acquisition bill that has to get passed. There has to be a single window clearance for approval of projects for environment, for example. For FDI, they have to deregulate insurance and multi-brand retail. They have to create a policy structure which is clear, where they don't have retrospective changes, and the foreign investor is able to believe that the changes are going to continue for a long period of time. They absolutely need to manage the fiscal deficit and pass through the pricing in LPG and diesel, which has been done obviously from a democratic perspective, and they need to implement GST to bring part of the parallel economy back into the mainstream. I guess the most important thing overall is that they need to provide a stable political structure to allow these changes to take place, which is where I think the critical downfall of India has been in the democratic structure. I actually think that the changes which are happening in China are far more difficult. For India, managing the supply side is purely a policy decision. It can be taken provided the policy structure and political structure in place. But in China, creating domestic demand is far more difficult. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And yes, you can get the growth rate back in China to 7-8%, but the real question is that will it be going back and doing the same thing again, in capital investment and spending more projects, or is it going to be really wealth distribution which creates domestic demand? The reform process, I think, in China is also a little bit more difficult, whether it's financial sector reform, whether it is using the financial institutions not as instruments of state policy, but as commercial entities, and the way it manages to transition into an environment which is much slower growth and possibly inflationary.
Very interesting. All right, I'm struck by a couple of strands that we've all talked about. And the first, if I may, is a point that Mr. Lim raised. And you were talking about the form of government. I think it's interesting that perhaps all of us, with the end of the Cold War, expected democratic capitalism to have won the day, whereas in fact China's success seems to show that while capitalism has won the day, it's not necessarily true that democracy has. So I think we linked the two, certainly those of us in the West did, and I'm not sure that's right. I think that it could be that you can have a bad government that's democratic, an ineffective government that's democratic, and as well as a bad government that's authoritarian, like, say, Chairman Mao's bad form of authoritarian government. And I'm wondering how the debate should be shaped by that point. Mr. Lin, do you agree with that? Can you have...
No, I don't. Because it's, I think what Pranay was saying also, I heard a lot in India that if we can't do this, we can't do that because we're democracy. Now, I'm not talking about Confucianism and all of that. I was brought up, educated in the West, and I was brought up, and I believe that democracy is an asset. It's not a liability. But all I hear in India is that it's a liability. Now, 10 years of each institution, bureaucracy, and blame it on the Brit. But 60 years, yeah, that's a long, long time. But I don't agree with you, Robyn, because these are title is too simple, dictatorship and democracy. If you look at the system, the political system in India, and you look at an area like Uttar Pradesh, with Nick spent a lot of time, how it's voting, how the vote banks, I mean, India, talk about vote banks, there are hundreds of thousands of votes that are controlled by, in Bihar.
So it's not a democracy, is your point?
Well, it's
not a
democracy, but it's a certain type, but a real governance problem. I think I'm trying to get...
So it's corruption that is... No,
it's not corruption, but for example, in Bihar, you would have elections, and the winner would be in jail. I mean,
half the parliament's in jail.
Sorry?
A number of members of parliament are in jail.
Well, they can, although they're in jail, they control votes. But I guess I would put it the other way around. I don't have explanation. I really don't. I mean, as I say, I lived for 6 years in India. I worked very intensively. I worked with a lot of chief ministers. I got to know people like Chandrababu Naidu and so on very well. I think it's an interactive process, I guess. You have to have a degree of literacy before people can vote. India, I mean, to be fair to India, India has enormous problem at the time of independence with the caste system, with the diversity. I mean, even the term literacy is very difficult to define in India, because you may be literate in one language, when you move to another state, it's a different language. Are you literate? So it is, the legacy in India is extremely difficult.
But that sounds like the same excuses the Indian government makes. So it's hard because of this, that,
yeah,
just get it done.
Nick wants to speak. Both countries have enormous governance problem. I think probably, and I think I'm trying to get away from this brand, and that's why when I went to India, I wanted to learn this is a democratic system. But when you really get down to it, it's very difficult for people to really reflect their view to the government. The government is not all that responsive to the people, despite the fact that there is an electoral process. And the other problem, of course, is the constant change that come about with election. I mean, Chandrababu Naidu was doing tremendous thing. I'm sure Mr. Gupta would agree. In fact, the most important journal he's a chief minister, a politician, but the most important journal in India voted him Businessman of the Year about
Hyderabad.
Andhra Pradesh is his state. But then there was a drought in Andhra Pradesh, and he got voted out. And I think he's back in his mango farm.
If I can comment, I mean, I don't disagree with you, but let me give you an analogy. I've had the opportunity to meet Minister Mentor Lee Kuan Yew twice. The first time was 20 years ago when he was in India at a press conference. And someone asked him, Minister Lee, you've done a phenomenal job in Singapore. Can you do the same thing in India? And he said, yes, I can, but I have two conditions. One is I will do what I want, and two is you will never question me. The second time I met him was actually 6 months ago, and I asked him a similar question as a follow-up to that, was that given all of the democratic problems that are happening in India, does the Indian population really value democracy, and is it intelligent enough to afford it? And he actually gave a very, very astute answer. He said that if India was not democratic in 1947, it would not have existed today. So the value of democracy, I think, is well understood by the population of India. That is no doubt about the fact. But the fact is that the political structure has misused it for personal gain. So I don't think anyone disputes the fact that democracy is the right thing for India and should be the one to stay. But at the same time, I think one should realize that having a single person creating a road of growth for any country without the challenge of anyone saying you will not do this is incredibly powerful to create an economic structure over the short term. And that concept is simply not existing in democracy. And that is what China had. If 200 years ago, I forget the name of the ruler, who integrated all the Chinese provinces by the bloodshed, if that had not happened, and China today was a mix of provinces, each with its own identity, China would have exactly the same problems as India.
Nick and then Louis.
That's 4,000 years ago.
I know. That is exactly the same.
Let's hear it.
I don't think we should pose the question, is democracy a burden or not, or an advantage or not. It's a question of how democracy works, and in particular, how governance works, because it's obviously intertwined with democracy. It's a different question. And
that's the point I was trying to make, that you can have bad governments that are democracies.
Governance, not governments.
So we can have bad governance and governments.
It's a very different thing, and it's governance that influences the investment climate, how the mechanisms of government actually work, and that's governance. And there India has had real problems. But when we look at the way in which democracy functions, democracy in India has stopped governments doing very bad things. Many of us remember and sort of lived through the Mrs. Gandhi's emergency, and the Indian people responded in a very powerful and clear sense, and they threw her out. And India has not had anything like the Great Famines, when autocracy was responsible for the killing of tens of millions of people.
Man-made famines, I think it's important to point out. Chairman Mao created.
I think that's what I said, Robyn. It's exactly autocracy that was able to create that kind of problem. And I agree, it's democracy probably that's held India together in a way which would have been very difficult. So I think that distinction between governance and democracy and the constraints, the very healthy constraints that democracy brings, are very important. But I think if we're to go back to the question of growth and how it happens and how the benefits of growth are spread or not spread, and very important points that Ed Lim was raising, I think we have to go to the question of where reform occurs. We had a lot of reform in India in the early 1990s, but it seems to be slowing down at the central level. But you do get a lot of change at the state level. If you look at Bihar or in the northeast, or Gujarat in the northwest, or Tamil Nadu in the south, you're seeing governments which are able to get on with reform and making things happen. And as Lewis said, it's the institutional side of the reform that's been particularly important. We have to understand in the examples. I'll just give one example from Bihar. One of the first things that Nitish Kumar did was to reform the police. How did he do it? He recruited a lot of people from who'd retired from the army into the police force. Now, for historical reasons, we haven't got the time to go into, but the army has functioned quite well in India. It's one of the least corrupt. No institution is uncorrupt in either China or India, but the army is one of the least corrupt institutions in India, and so those kind of characters came in with a very different culture, and that was very important. It's just one example. There's so many others that we, through the panel, could share, but we don't have time. So I think the state level reform is very important. And finally, let me remind about the point I was making about the low base, in which essentially Isha Ahluwalia made yesterday. Things are starting to change. Just take gender issues and women in education. In the village I've been working with for 40 years, 20 years ago hardly any girls were at school. Now you're seeing perhaps 20-25% of the cohort at school. It's still dreadful, it should be 100%, but you're seeing that change. You're seeing more women go to university in India. In fact, you're seeing for that particular age group labour force participation going down for women. But it's actually a good sign, because the reason it's going down is because more women are getting educated and they'll be in the labour force later. So you've got a potential rate of growth there as women become more integrated in the labour force. It's very high integration in China, very low in India, but it's changing. So that will be a powerful source of growth as well. So it's very easier for all of us who work so much on India every now and again to get ourselves down. But if you see what's happening at the state level, if you see how that education of women is starting to change in India, and being reflected, of course, in drops in fertility rates as well, I think you see grounds for hope.
All right. I want to move on to the question, if I may, of the influence of the Cultural Revolution on current leaders. But first, Louis wants to make a point.
I just wanted to make a point, because we will probably never be able to get rid of putting a lot of our attention on these labels, democracy and whatever the other system is. But I would just like to just make a point, and also bring the discussion a little bit back to China. If we forget for a moment about what the technical nature of the system is, the system by which people's concerns and aspirations filter through into the policy, into the policies of the country, I would say that if you look at these more objective criteria like accountability and legitimacy and even voice, I think the Chinese governance system gets much higher marks than many of us sometimes think when we put it in that category. Oh, it's not a democracy.
So it may be responsive even though it is not. People don't have to vote.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Yeah. Can we talk about the next leader, presumably of China, Xi Jinping? It strikes me as very interesting because of his experience in the Cultural Revolution. As many of you know, he was sent down to the countryside, worked, as a laborer on a farm for a decade roughly, and yet he's one of the last. He and his generation are one of the last that will have had that experience. How will that change China going forward?
Okay, but let me first, I think, response to the discussion here about democracy and autocracy. I fully agree with Louis. When I got interested in India, my intention was also to compare democracy with autocracy. But gradually I found that's not the right comparison. First of all, it's going to turn the discussion to be really emotional. That we almost got into that. I think we got to move kind of deeper than that. Robyn asked the influence of Cultural Revolution. My sense is that China can do without Cultural Revolution. Cultural Revolution was just destruction. It didn't do anything to China. If we can say anything about kind of new China, I think the revolution, the Communist revolution, or the revolutions before that, were just enough for China to turn the society upside down. I think that's also very important. The Communist Party, it's not just a name, it has a real content. At least from the very beginning in the 1950s, it had that kind of a commitment to create an equal society. That's very important. I think that also set China apart from India. The Communist Party was dominated by the elites. We have to admit that. And the policies, of course, first taken by the Communist Party was very much toward the elitist group, not to ordinary people. That actually set the trajectory different from China. So when China started economic reform at the end of the 1980s, at the end of 1970s, China was quite an equal society, much equal, more equal than India at that time. I think that's a kind of a historical root. And I also do want to say that India and China are so different. Actually, the Indian growth is marvelous by international comparison. What's wrong with Indian growth? I mean, it's a great growth story. If there are differences, there must be some historical events defining that. But coming back to Robyn's question, well, this generation of leaders have had this tremendous traumatic experience in Cultural Revolution. I think it learned a lot from the countryside, and that's also going to shape their way to lead the country. I don't know, I cannot read the mind of Xi Jinping, but I think one of the advantage of this generation of leaders is that they have a real sense of China, they have a real sense of the needs of ordinary people. And that's very important, that's very critical for China's continuous economic growth.
Right. Believe it or not, it's a huge summary. We have just 15 minutes. Here's what I want to do. I want to very quickly call on those of you in the audience, a few of you, to tell me your question, and then we'll have people address it. So, Mr. Yin, very quickly.
I personally believe the sustainable development of a nation, of an enterprise, or even a family depends on the balance of not only economical development, but political development and cultural development. You guys mentioned something about about democracy. Everybody knows that Jesus Christ was crucified by democratic procedure. You know, China and India are not like those pilgrims from Mayflower. Those people, you know, understand each other, has the same education level, but not India and China. You have to take a long time. Education, and most important is cultural development, in my opinion. Okay, the question, do you agree that this is like a propeller, the cultural and political and economic development must be balanced all the time so the boat can go straight. Otherwise it go round and round. Okay, coming back to democracy.
Interesting question. Next question.
No,
just, next question.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to answer the questions later. I think that we're going to have some similar strands of questions. First here and then in the back. Just behind, yeah.
I agree entirely with Edwin Lim.
And your question is?
The question, all right. My question is, nobody's talked about demography. Demography is destiny, I would submit.
Very, very interesting point. And talk about demography.
And just to add, China's demography dividend has just ended. India's is beginning. If we can get our act together.
Yes, if there are jobs. Good point. And 2 rows behind, please. Man there. Yep.
Is it possible that the big difference between the level of development in China and India has less to do with governance and growth models and more to do with the fact that China was compelled to negotiate access to the WTO, a process that took over 20 years and resulted in wrenching changes that they had to make, whereas India was a founding member of GATT and was under no external pressure to make changes and structural changes in its economy and adopt to the international standards.
Right. One more question here. So that's interesting. Does China need a wedge, or does India need a wedge to make reforms, whether financial system reforms, WTO, or opening treaty ports long ago? John Sauce.
Just a quickie, the panel referred sort of obliquely to corruption in both countries as being sort of prevalent. Is that something that's kind of a nuisance to be generally managed, or is it something that in either case could really sink the ship or really change the trajectory of the 2 countries?
All right. Very quickly. Ed Lim, you want to go first?
Yeah, I don't think we're getting the message across. I think the answer to all the questions, for me anyway, is going to be no to all of them. Because what I'm trying to get at is that...
I thought you were just saying no to me.
No, because I'm trying to get away from these labels, corruption, democracy, and so on. It's a very complicated issue, and I think they're going to it's governance, and the aspect of the Indian system and institution that are good governance. There are also others that are bad governance. It's not enough to say democracy, dictatorship, autocracy, or whatever. There are governance issues in both countries, including corruptions and rent-seeking and all of that. And you got to go below that. And also, at the same time, in terms of result, the one point I was trying to make, quoting from Amartya Sen, is that growth is important, it's essential, but it's not enough.